When it comes to Yemen these past 4 years, is it business as usual for arms dealers? Donald Trump may be intent on winding down U.S. presence in Syria and Afghanistan, but in the name of national security, the U.S. president has vetoed a bipartisan measure to end Washington's backing of the brutal civil war that's brought the Arab world's poorest state to the brink of famine. Is the veto for support to the Saudi-led coalition justified? How far will Congress go in this fight with the White House? What to make of Trump's fidelity to the Yemen campaign leader, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed Ben Salman? Others like Canada and Germany have frozen arms sales to Riyadh. The German decision is impacting deliveries to the Saudis of equipment that's co-produced with the UK and France. France, whose weapons, according to freshly leaked documents, continue to make their way to Yemen via Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. We'll hear Paris's explanation and comment on it. What's become of those UN-brokered talks to find a lasting truce and a roadmap for peace between Iran-aligned Houthi militias and Yemen's Saudi-backed coalition government? How to break the impasse today in the France 24 debate. Those Western arms sales under scrutiny. And joining us from Washington, D.C., two guests with roots in Yemen. Sama Al-Hamdani, visiting fellow at Georgetown University's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Also with us, Fatima Abu Al-Assar, Senior Analyst at the Arabia Foundation.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome to the show. Welcome as well to Fanny Petitbon of the charity CARE, which has been present in Yemen since 1992. Thank you for stopping in.
Thank you.
And from Rome, he's a contributor to digital investigators Bellingcat, Leonie Hadavi of the EU Arms Project Investigator. Thanks for joining us here. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. It's one of the rare occasions where the U.S. Congress has evoked the War Powers Act, a law that was passed in the 1970s after Vietnam. It gives lawmakers an oversight on involvement in foreign conflicts. Also a rare instance of bipartisanship these days in Washington. Enter, though, the President of the United States. Thomas Waterhouse has more.
For the second time during his mandate at the White House, Donald Trump has wielded his power of veto, this time to block a resolution which aimed to end US military assistance to the Saudi coalition fighting Iran-backed rebels in Yemen. The president said the congressional text would harm US foreign policy as well as Washington's bilateral relationships.
This resolution is an unnecessary, dangerous attempt to weaken my constitutional authorities, endangering the lives of American citizens and brave service members both today and in the future.
The joint resolution is passed.
By a vote of 247 to 175, the War Powers resolution got House approval earlier this month, after the Senate gave its backing to the text back in March. Those votes were a clear sign that Capitol Hill is growing increasingly anxious about the cozy relationship between Trump and his Saudi allies, especially after the murder in October of Jamal Khashoggi. Billions of American dollars worth of arms and intelligence make their way to Saudi-led forces in Yemen each year. Democrats say this support has to stop.
The conflict in Yemen is a horrific humanitarian crisis that challenges the conscience of the entire world. Yet the president has cynically chosen to contravene a bipartisan, bicameral vote of the Congress and perpetuate America's shameful involvement in this heartbreaking crisis.
The concerns of leading Democrats have also been echoed by the likes of David Miliband, the president of the International Rescue Committee. He's described Trump's veto as being morally wrong. But President Trump's move has been welcomed with open arms by the UAE, with the government there calling it timely and strategic.
Fatima Abu Al-Assar, what's your reaction to that veto?
It was expected, right? The Senate was somewhat undecided about this vote last year. They didn't have the sufficient votes to let it pass. But I think the Khashoggi's death has just helped push things. for the Senate. And, as they've realigned this year to call for it, I think, it was expected that it would pass because there was just this outrage because of the Saudi behavior. And it was expected that Trump would veto it because the Congress and the administration haven't really seen eye to eye in this war on Yemen since it started. The Congress definitely has, is doing it for morally correct reasons. They want to stop the negative aspects of the Saudi involvement in the war in Yemen, but at the same time, the Trump administration also has some important data point that we should not be neglecting as they want to support their allies in protect them. The U.S. administration cites that its support for Saudi Arabia is largely defensive, and it surely does not want to see the Houthi militia that is backed by Iran to dominate in Yemen. So both sides are right, and both sides don't seem to have a strong strategy in terms of what needs to be done to end the conflict and deal with the humanitarian crisis in Yemen.
Sama Al-Hamdani, do you agree?
I agree that it was expected to not pass, but I also think that there is a slight bit of hope in the sense that the Trump administration is sending messaging that is saying that they want peace in Yemen. We're also hearing a lot that Saudi Arabia wants out of this war. And so perhaps this is a way for the U.S. to kind of save face and protect Saudi Arabia while they deal and search for an exit behind closed doors, which I think is likely to happen for the interest of both the United States and Saudi Arabia. I think the language of the administration has definitely been searching for peace. And I think that unfortunately Yemen, the issue of Yemen and the war in Yemen, wherever you put it, it ends up being kind of a bargaining chip, which is what we're seeing here in the United States. It's a way to kind of push back against President Trump. And I hope that it was a lot more about the Yemen affair and a lot less about Khashoggi's death and about the president's dealings, as much as it is about the Yemeni people that are dying and are suffering as a consequence of the war and as a consequence of lack of security and governance on the ground. And so I think that the U.S. is certainly in a specific situation where Yemen has kind of become this issue where, the Senate pushes back against the administration. And I think that there are a few for sure in the Senate that care about Yemen. But this issue needs continuous pressure. And I think that it would be better for Yemen if both the administration and the Senate and the Congress in general just sees eye to eye in terms of what they want to see happen in Yemen, which is immediate peace.
Well, Fanny Petitbon, what kind of message does this veto send to Saudi Arabia?
It sends a message of a tacit endorsement that actually the suffering of Yemenis can continue with the support of the U.S. government. And it's not sending the message that we want to hear now, clearly. It's against the will of American citizens, because if the legislation passed, it's really because it reflected the willingness by Americans to see the support of the U.S. to the Saudi-led coalition to actually end. So knowing the suffering that the Yemenis have been going through for the past 4 years, knowing the level of the humanitarian consequences of the crisis, this is just not responsible from the U.S. government to actually say to continue to providing support to Saudi Arabia.
Before I cross to Leon, let me just get Fatima to react to that. Fatima Abu Al-Sar. Does it give a message to Mohammed Ben Salman that if you want, you can go full throttle in Yemen?
I mean, I think, this would be a dangerous message. The United States cannot ask Saudi Arabia or cannot allow Saudi Arabia to act with full impunity. And I don't think that was the message behind the White House statement that was issued today. I think that the United States has been limited in its defense, in its support for the war in Yemen. It has been strategically helping the Saudis get to certain targets, and it's been helping in curbing the civilian deaths by identifying certain military activities for the Houthi. So the statement came across today. It didn't say with open arms, we're going to support Saudi Arabia. In fact, it said, we are going to look for a peaceful solution in Yemen, and that is what is needed. And, in turn, if we look at the War Powers Resolution, it doesn't mention anything about the need to deal with the Houthi threat. The catastrophe, the humanitarian catastrophe that is there, it's not just one-sided. And I think it's a mistake that we continue seeing it as only the Saudi coalition responsibility. They have exacerbated, the Saudis have exacerbated the situation in Yemen. But, what we see on the ground is, in terms of the exploitation of the humanitarian suffering, it's largely advanced by the Houthis. Credible reports by the Associated Press and by the World Food Program, a UN agency, said that 60% of the food aid is being stolen by the Houthi militia. That is a catastrophic number. You have the Houthi militia has also blocked vaccines, cholera vaccines, because it still is in their interest to live in a chaos state. A militia like the Houthis thrive on chaos. And, the lack of the reluctance from the international community to say we're going to take a stance against this in the same way that, that the international community is taking a stance against Bashar al-Assad in Syria is one of the things that I think continues to be a setback in here. I think that the War Powers Resolution has to do more with what Congress wants to authorize, more so, and the Trump's authority, more so than actually what's going on in the war in Yemen. Otherwise, we would have seen a more balanced picture. But right now, we're getting just half a picture.
Leon Hadavi, do you agree with Fatima's characterization of the U.S. role in Yemen?
First of all, I wanted to debunk a bit of a myth of these items and tools that have been sold by mostly Western manufacturers to countries that are part of the Saudi-led coalition as defensive. The evidence that is available from what we can see on the ground and in the air, to that effect, is a long list of highly lethal weapons that from the smallest level of individual weapons to very complex weapon systems, they do not seem to be in nature or the way they are applied, the way they are employed into this specific scenario to serve any sort of defensive purpose. My personal opinion about the strategy that is being put in place, I don't know personally if this veto is part of a general new approach that the US is trying to apply to its allies in the Gulf. But it certainly, it has been to a certain extent a method for the US to control and to limit, in some cases, the damages that, for example, airstrikes have caused to civilian lives and objects. But still, what I think is missing here, and that's my personal opinion, in a carrot versus stick approach, this does sound like a soft and nuanced legitimization of the coalition continuous attempts. And that's how I would characterize it so far.
And Fanny Petitbon, you heard there Fatima Abu Al-Atsar talk about the way that the belligerent forces, in this case she was talking about the Houthi militias, blocking aid, blocking vaccines. Is that something that CARE has witnessed?
Well, in our work on the ground, what we witness is that all parties to the conflict are breaching international humanitarian law. So in my remarks earlier, I was not saying that the Saudi was bearing the total responsibility of the suffering of the Yemenis, but really all parties to the conflict are contributing to the situation that we're facing now. And what we see as operating agencies on the ground is that it's becoming extremely difficult for us, increasingly difficult to access populations in need. Right now, 80% of Yemenis need humanitarian assistance. And what we see is that sometimes it takes us 6 to 7 months to actually get authorization from local authorities to actually get access to these populations. What we see is the level of insecurity, both in the north and in the south, is really difficult. So we have...
So how does it work concretely? If you have an aid shipment that's going to Yemen, where does it go from? How long does it take to get there, and where does it wind up?
Well, it really depends. But I mean, of course, the harbors are really important. They're really key entry points for us. So the blockade that has been going on in Hodeida for more than a year now has really decreased our capacities to actually receive that aid. But when we receive humanitarian aid, food, fuel, then we use, of course, cars, trucks to drive it in different parts of the country. And
Hodeida, that Red Sea port, which is what the gateway, they say, to 70% of the country's population?
Yes, exactly.
So what are your other options if Hodeida is, if the truce isn't holding there?
Well, we have Aden as well, where we can get different products coming in, but what we see is that for the past year and a half, the country has been just surviving, and it's just we need the international community to not look away and to really take action. And so for now, a ceasefire across the country is needed as soon as possible, and we also need Western powers to actually take responsibility and not just saying we want to alleviate the suffering of Yemenis, but we also need to stop our arms sales to parties to the conflict. So this is a clear call to France, for instance, to stop their arms sales.
Yeah, we've talked about the U.S. military support for the coalition. When we come back, we're going to look at fresh revelations concerning France. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at Western arms sales to Yemen in the context of that veto by Donald Trump of a bill that was passed bipartisanly, if that's a word, in the U.S. Congress to call for withdrawal from Yemen, and also amid fresh revelations, which we're going to talk about in a moment here in France. We're talking about it with Sama Al-Hamdani, visiting fellow at Georgetown University's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, also in the U.S. Capitol. Fatima Abu Al-Asrar, who is a senior analyst at the Arabia Foundation. Fanny Petitbon is with the charity CARE, and we welcome back from Rome. He's a contributor to digital investigators Bellingcat, Leon Hadavi of the EU Arms Project Investigator. Now, here in France, the government insists that its weapons and hardware are, just like we heard regarding from what the Pentagon has been saying, for purely defensive purposes and far from Yemen's front lines. Well, not so, say leaked classified documents, which most notably chartered a shipment last September from the port of Le Havre here in France to Jeddah and Saudi Arabia. Nicholas Rushworth has more.
The French NGO calls its report Made in France. It uses information from a confidential French army document dating to last September, showing that French weapons have been used by the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. The weapons include tanks, warplanes, armoured vehicles, shells and cannons. Those weapons, the report suggests, may have been used to kill dozens, if not hundreds, of civilians. Responding to the NGO's report, the French Prime Minister's office said, to our knowledge, French weapons available to coalition members are mostly placed in a defensive position outside Yemen or on rights of way used by the coalition, and not on the front line. We are not aware of any civilian casualties resulting from their use. The sale of weapons to Saudi Arabia has been a source of controversy for years. This is what the French Defense Minister Florence Parly had to say back in January.
What I can tell you is that we've sold no weapons recently that could have been used in the war in Yemen. However, it is possible that French weapens have been used in the conflict because they were sold to Saudi Arabia over 20 years ago.
The NGO says it cross-checked findings against data provided by the US-based conflict monitor ACLED. The allegations add pressure on Western nations, including France, Britain, and the United States, which have long been accused of turning a blind eye to the humanitarian crisis in Yemen.
Léon Nadavi, what's your reaction when you hear the French government state that it's not aware of any civilian casualties from French weaponry or hardware?
Well, I think that is a very hard claim to maintain. Evidence have shown, I mean, in the case of the report that was just leaked, these are official French documents that say that such equipment may have been used in areas where civilians were present and where damages were caused to civilian objects. The fact that that some of this equipment may be physically placed within the border does not exclude that they may be causing serious damages on the other side of the border, meaning in Yemen, and that civilians are involved in the use of this equipment. There is plenty of evidence without even going to leaked documents by using open source material, that this argument, although has been used by different governments, we saw President Trump being the last one of a consistent list, this is not what appears from situation on the ground. Some of these weapons have been used very deeply, have been seen very deeply within Yemeni territory. Also in the case of French equipment, the Leclerc main battle tank is an example, operated by the United Arab Emirates. And another thing I wanted to add, talking about the kind of equipment that is employed, we have seen the majority of these deaths caused to civilians are caused by air bombing campaigns. That is done by flying aircraft above the territory of Yemen. So it would be a position that is very hard to be defended. And I think the evidence is pretty self-sufficient in explaining how this equipment has found its way into Yemen, or whether it hasn't physically been inside of Yemen. It's part of a very large campaign that involves civilians in the first place. I think
just on that point, Léon Nadavi, we saw in that report back in January, the French defense minister saying you can't hold us responsible for weapons sales that date back a long time.
Yes, that is a point that the analysis will have to focus on. When selling weapons to another country, there are other criteria that are key and should be taken into consideration, and that is the risk of diversion of these weapons that could have been passed on to a user that is not the legitimate user, which is included in the end user certificate, which is part of the deal that is agreed on. And also the risk of such weapons being used to further violation of human rights or internal repression. So I think just sticking with the date criteria might be too little. There has been plenty of open source evidence that shows that the Saudi Arabian army and the Emirates army are not the only operator of these weapons and weapon systems. We have seen vehicles that were originally intended for their exclusive use. They've been passed on to local militias, some of them affiliated to Al-Qaeda. It's a paradox, but some of this hardware has even found their way into Houthi hands. That is how relaxed the monitoring system is once the weapon has been shipped. And I think the point that the minister is making, it's really confirming this point that I'm making right here, meaning that once the weapon has been sold and a certain amount of time has passed, it's sort of not of your business anymore. Well, it still is. That's how the system actually works. And certainly it should teach this exporting country something about further deals.
About deals going forward. Let me bring in Fanny Petitbon on this. First of all, we heard in part one of our discussion, one of the justifications for Donald Trump doing it is the fight against terror, support against these Iran-aligned Houthi militias. In the case of France, what's the justification for selling weapons to not just the Saudis, by the way, but also the Emiratis?
Well, the justification is actually also the fight against terrorism, and it's one of those.
And what do you think? Is that the real reason?
Well, there is that, and of course, economic reasons. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates are among the list of top 6 customers of France. Between 2015 and 2017, France sold more than $4 billion of weapons to these two countries. So there's a huge economic interest behind it. But France cannot put profits in front of the lives of civilians. And so right now, we have official documents saying that French weapons are being used in that conflict. And these weapons are actually used against civilians. So, and the fact is that now we know that the government has had this information since September. So we cannot accept that the French government keeps making that sort of statement that they don't have evidence that the French weapons are actually used against civilians. We do have this information, and now France needs to act upon it.
Act upon it, and we heard in part one of our discussion how in the United States, public opinion, lawmakers have been energized, particularly since the October murder of Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul. Here in France, there isn't that much coverage, is there, of the war in Yemen or of France's role?
Well, it's true that we don't hear a lot about Yemen in the media, but recent surveys conducted actually in mid-March show that French citizens are actually in favor of the suspension of arms, French arms sales and arms transfer to Saudi Arabia and to the Emirates, and are also calling for what NGOs like CARE have been calling for months now, which is a strengthened parliamentary control over French arms sales. So we want the French National Assembly to actually establish a systematic commission to review the sales and transfer of French arms sales.
Sama Al-Hamdani, what's your comment on France's role in the 4-year-old conflict in Yemen?
It certainly is not that different from the United States, if not worse at times, since the debate is not as heated as it is here in the United States. I find it a little bit surprising and a little bit shocking because we find the entire world, not just France, the entire Western world, in a position that is a little bit ironic, where they supply the countries with weapons, claiming that they're just for defense, when, of course, when there's a war, those weapons will be used. So there's that first irony there. And then the second irony is that you're selling the weapons to a country that's engaging in war, but you're also the same countries that can push for peace and are the only ones that can stand up to the conflict in Yemen and say, hey, enough is enough. we need to find a peaceful exit here. And so you have these countries kind of, it works in a way where they want to benefit economically from it. Therefore, they might be not in the best position to push for peace in Yemen. And so Yemenis are kind of the victim of the economy of war in Europe and in the United States. And so until these countries are able to kind of stop selling arms on that level and to focus more on the individuals, then we'll see a difference. And I think that the fact that France continues to sell arms to Saudi Arabia and the UAE is probably very closely linked to media coverage on Yemen. And I feel that if Yemen was more of the discussion in France, then things might be a little bit different.
Fatima Abu al-Alsar, we talk about those sales to Saudi Arabia and to the UAE. The Emiratis and the Saudis, they don't necessarily, though, have the same agenda, even though it's a coalition, and they don't have the same areas where they're fighting necessarily. What do you make of the UAE's role and your reaction to what we've been talking about regarding France?
I think, the war in Yemen, the conflict in Yemen, which started with the Houthis' overthrow of the government, just left Yemen really exposed to various geopolitical interests and international interests, frankly. So everyone, including Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, the United States, France, and, all other actors are narrowly focusing on what gains can they get from this conflict. So United Arab Emirates is finding a foothold in the south of Yemen. It's finding a foothold in the ports, and this may not prove to be it proves to be maybe bad for the calculations of a unified Yemen, but it's proven to be very beneficial for Southerners who have had a grievance for almost 2 decades that went unaddressed. So there is a silver lining there for the UAE involvement. But
really,
at the same time,
in the case of the UAE, we've noticed that the anti-Iran rhetoric is not as heated. We saw the Emirates, for instance, help Iran after they had those recent floods. There's this. Some speculate that the UAE is carving out its patch in South Yemen. Is that how you see it?
I mean, yes, and I think that they are somewhat open about it. It's open that they want to support the Southern Transitional Council. That's something that is actually helping build a more stable South or a political South. And this does not mesh well with the Yemeni government. So we're seeing here some divisions, some sensitivities. This is going to play out if the war with the Houthis somewhat end. The new scene of conflict is going to be the south of Yemen, and I think we have to be worried about that. But I think that the United Arab Emirates is somewhat playing a constructive role because they're listening. They're listening to the grievances in the south. They're empowering the people in the south to talk about issues after having been long repressed. So, and that for me is I think is a silver lining. The Hadi government that was overthrown does not see it that way, and certainly the Houthis do not see it that way. They're also playing, I think, an important role in Hodeidah. That means by mobilizing a largely southern and Hodeidah army to push back against the Houthis' influence in Hodeidah. And this is really critical. I mean, without that force that they have organized, I don't think the Houthis would have had any interest in coming to the negotiating table. So I think there are positive sides and negative sides to this equation. And there are many Yemenis that are very happy with the interventions that, either Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates are conducting in the south of Yemen.
Sama Al-Hamdani, you agree?
I think that the role of the international community on all levels should lessen up, and I think that the will is ultimately in the hands of the Yemeni people. And I know for a fact from knowing history well and from knowing politics that assistance on that level doesn't come free of charge. And so the implications of that are worrying. I think that the UAE and Saudi Arabia have really gone in trying to protect themselves from Iran and have kind of exceeded that position that they took at first. And they're now direct participants in a conflict that doesn't seem like it's going to end. I think what needs to be a priority for Yemen is to stop the suffering of the Yemeni people who are paying the price of this war, and to put the politics on a second level where we allow Yemenis to kind of decide what they want next. But I think this is what the war is doing, is it's ignoring the voices of the humanitarian crisis. It's ignoring the suffering of the people, and it's prioritizing political positioning. And what's really unfortunate is that we see the Arab coalition headed by Saudi Arabia and the KSA to have different perspective in Yemen's war and not a clear goal in the way of how they want to handle the conflict and what they want to see in a future Yemen. How do they expect their neighboring country to operate? And so that kind of involvement with a lot of weapons at a really tragic time for Yemenis is just it's a formula for tragedy.
Fanny Petitbon, are we witnessing the breakup, the return to when there were two different separate countries at the end of the day?
Well, it's difficult to say as of now. What really matters, as we just heard from other speakers here, is that what we need is actually to make sure to provide hope to the Yemeni population, which is really running out of breath, running out of hope. And so the peace process is really something that the international community must support, really to have an inclusive peace process with women's organization, youth, all the parties around the table, and to try to find a lasting solution. Of course, this process will take probably still quite a long time. So we need to make sure the ceasefire is actually implemented, the ceasefire that was agreed in Stockholm in December, implemented as soon as possible. And that, of course, humanitarian access is restored. So what matters is actually human lives rather than politics.
All right, we'll talk about that ceasefire in a moment. But first, Leon Hadavi, of course, another component is, we were talking about it at the outset and throughout the program, is weapons sales. What's your reaction when you hear that the French and the British have expressed criticism regarding the fact that Germany has frozen its weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, some components which are assembled in coordination with the Germans?
Well, I think the public opinion is it's following the issue very closely, because I think there are a lot of organizations, the EU Arms Project, Bellingcat, many others, that are bringing forward a lot of evidence that is collected through open source that really show how these tools are being used in this conflict. We, as EU Arms, have looked at different countries. It started with the Netherlands, then it went to Italy. We looked into Germany, and something will be published about Belgium very soon. I think the public opinion was particularly eager to learn about this evidence in Germany. Probably the German government has also been sensible in sort of addressing the issue in this way. I don't know, it comes at some point to power politics and different dynamics within the government of Germany. But I think we've seen this wave that it's rising, and also in France right now. I think this is coming more and more to the center of the public debate. If initially many were interested in or were campaigning for the ban on Saudi weapons, it was mostly because of the Khashoggi murder. I think right now there are a lot of people that are learning about things that their government has kept from them. The application of the granting of licenses by national governments to weapons manufacturers in different Western states for products that have such a destructive charge and which end up with such effects in Yemen, I think it's something that is you can see more of online, and hopefully more people will be ready to be informed about
this. All right, so growing pressure from public opinion. Growing pressure from public opinion, you're saying, and we were talking about the pressure a moment ago with Fanny Petitbon about the needed to make that ceasefire stick. Last December, there were celebrations in Sweden when Yemen's warring sides agreed to a truce around the port city of Hodeidah. Well, in the better late than never department, the UN broker of those talks, British diplomat Martin Griffiths, telling the UN Security Council this Monday that both sides had finally accepted a detailed operational plan for step one in a withdrawal of forces from that Red Sea port.
Hodeidah is a test of many things, Mr. President, the principle of which is of leadership. And I like to hope that we shall see in the coming days the people's trust in those leaderships vindicated in this test.
That sounds kind of circumspect. He doesn't sound like someone who's sure that we're going to really get to that step one, does he?
Well, it's really difficult to look into the future in Yemen. So it's really by a step-by-step approach that Martin Griffith is taking. And even though it's not delivering concrete, immediate results, the fact that he's able to talk to all parties to the conflict is actually a major step forward compared to previous special envoys. So it's important to not just complain or discredit this initiative. I think we really need to make sure that all parties, but also all Yemenis, are included in the peace process, even though it takes a while.
Fatima Abu al-Alsar, you agree that right now, if you're the mediator, the important thing is to really keep those channels of communication open with everybody?
I mean, okay, what's communication going to do at the moment? We have had an agreement. The agreement needs to be implemented. And just continuing to get verbal reassurances and verbal buy-in without really seeing anything on the ground is not going to advance peace in any way. So I feel like, Martin Griffiths and others are saying, don't be skeptical of the process, be sure that this is going to happen. We've given it 5 months. We've given it 5 years. And this is not seeing a concrete resolution. There is immense international pressure to find peace in Yemen. And, he is entrusted to run this process. He is in a bind. Yes, he's communicating with everybody, but he's in a bind. And I think he knows very well that he can't really get all the parties to do what they need to do. Primarily, the Houthis have a problem. They're not withdrawing. And the UN ceasefire monitor, the UN Security Council ceasefire monitor, the previous one, Patrick Kamer, was open in his criticism about the party that's delaying this, which is the Houthis. The Houthis have had a sham redeployment process. This was not satisfactory. And they continue to obfuscate. They continue to push for, further deadlines, more information, more clarification, while even, attacking certain
what you're saying
sites
is that it's a stalling tactic. Unfortunately, we're out of time for now. I want to thank you so much, though, for joining us, Fatima Abu al-Alsar from Washington. I also want to thank Sama al-Hamdani here in the studio, Fanny Petitbon, and from Rome, Leon Hadavi. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.